Here we go. Yeah, there it is. So Ralph, I want to thank you so much for pushing us and doing a lot of the contact and organization for this. So we have John Evans here and Ed Kilduff and Tim Blanchard. He was here, and they're going to talk to us about their perceptions of the Critical Areas Ordinance, and we're going to see some cool maps and things like that. So let's give them a round and have at it, guys.
Well, thank you. I don't know whether this is on. I hope so. I hope you can hear me otherwise. Up? No, you're fine.
Turn it up. You're good. You're good.
Don't know if I can, but I'll turn myself up. On behalf of the Common Sense Alliance, we are we want to thank the Eagle Forum for putting this together. It's probably the largest group that we've had an opportunity to talk with about these issues well, maybe ever at one time. With the exception of a forum that we had last year over in Friday Harbor. So we're going to move pretty quickly. I will get right to it. For those of you who don't know, there's always a little bit of alphabet soup in these things, and some folks are more conversant in this than others. There's really two sets of regulation that we're dealing with that are separate, have separate rules and requirements attached to them, but are interrelated. Okay. I don't know. In any event, one of those is the Critical Areas Ordinance. That's the first thing we're dealing with, and that's a requirement under the Growth Management Act in the state. And the requirement the county is subject to there is that we review and, if necessary, revise our provisions to protect the functions and values of critical areas. After that, and we're beginning this process now, will be an update to our Shoreline Master Program, which is a bit of gobbledygook for a set of regulations adopted by the county, approved by the Department of Ecology with respect to shoreline use. There is a great deal of overlap between these two, and so it's easy to get confused about what's what. So where are we now? At this point, the county has conducted a review of science to come up with what's known as best available science. I'll raise some questions about that in a moment. But the bottom line is we still haven't seen anything we consider to be proof of a problem that our current rules are not working. What we provided on the slide is a citation you can get on the internet, and there's also copies of these slides over on the table, so if you can get that later. We'll let you get to the best available science document and review it for yourself if you've got some time and the willpower to do so. The Shoreline Master Program update, next step there is a public visioning summit meeting. They'll be on all the islands, but the one on Orcas is on September 21st, coming up very quickly, 5 o'clock in the Madrona Room at the Orcas Center. So I have a real concern about this because I thought we already had a vision. I thought we already had a bunch of rules and had already figured out how the shorelines ought to work, and it looks to me like they've been working pretty well. But the Department of Ecology says we have to revision. And so if you have any concerns about revisioning, or if your vision of what the shoreline ought to be has changed or hasn't changed, I very much encourage you to show up for that meeting. There'll be an opportunity for comments at that meeting, and I think it's critical that we let people know what's what. Also, there are some proposed revisions going on right now to the enforcement rules related to both of these sets of regulations. The concern here is that the proposals would dramatically change and dramatically affect the way enforcement works in ways that I think are problematic. And it's even more problematic in that it's not clear that we need to have tougher enforcement rules because there hasn't really been much enforcement of the rules that we have already. So I think if you look around, things look pretty good without heightened enforcement, and now heightened enforcement seems, I think, problematic for our community. Now, there are some changes that ought to be made in those rules. I don't want to get tied up with those right now. Here's a slide. I won't go through it in tremendous detail, but there is a Planning Commission meeting this Friday on wetlands. There are some county council meetings coming up in relation to the critical areas provisions, and other Planning Commission meetings. So I've given you the dates and times for a few of them in our materials, but check the county website as well, and we provided a site for that in the materials. What I wanted to do now is turn pretty quickly to a few things that I consider to be dangerous misperceptions. I won't get into where they came from today. I'll let everyone reach their own conclusions about where those misperceptions may have come from. But it's important to recognize some of these things. One of those is that only a few parcels will be affected by these rules. That's simply not true. In fact, almost every parcel, at least in one way of thinking about it, every parcel will be affected in one way or another based on these rules. Most of the parcels will be directly affected in one way or another by these rules. So don't be taken in by that. Also, don't be confused that these rules will only affect new development. That's simply not true as well. Because, as we'll talk about buffers in a few moments, but as these buffer areas, that's the areas around the critical areas that are intended to protect the critical areas, are expanded, then there will be increased regulation of what can and cannot be done in those areas of your property. And so even if you're existing, even if your house has been there for 100 years, there are activities that you carry on your land, around your house. If those buffer areas are extended into those areas in which you currently carry on activities, you've got a garden, you've got an orchard, you pasture horses, you have an annual picnic or an annual softball game, we'll have to figure out whether the rules actually will allow you to continue to do those things if that area becomes a buffer zone. Next, let's see, at the town hall meeting, if any of you were there at the fire hall just last week, we were told that you'll be able to keep on doing what you're doing. I submit that that's not at all clear, and it very much depends on what you're doing and what you've been doing on your property and how close the area of your land that you're using to one of these critical areas is. So while I think it makes sense that you ought to be able to continue to do what you're doing, the rules as they're proposed right now don't get that job done. Let's see, we also hear that we have to do this, or we have to do that, because if we don't, the Department of Ecology or the Growth Management Hearings Board will come down on us. They'll invalidate our rules, they'll make us change them. That might or might not be true, but don't take that as gospel, because there are a lot of things we can do. There's a great deal of flexibility that the county has in figuring out how to go about protecting our environment and protecting the functions and values of our critical areas. So don't be led to that we need to be shoehorned into particular ways of doing this that some folks want us to do. Finally, do not give in to the misperception that there's nothing we can do. It's easy to get yourself into a funk and begin to think that, well, whatever the planning department, the Department of Ecology, the tribes, or the other well-funded interest groups want to do is what they'll do, and they'll be able to do it no matter what. It is true that they are better funded and better organized and true believers. But that does not mean that we, the citizens of San Juan County, don't have an ability to affect the outcome. I firmly believe we do. So those are the misperceptions. Now let me talk about the effective analysis that we've had to date. Now the county has spent a lot of money and a lot of time looking at these issues. That is true. There's no question about that. Don't ask me how much money, I don't know. It's a great question and it ought to be asked, but I don't know the answer to it. Notwithstanding the time and the money that has been spent on this, the analysis so far fails to identify or quantify critical area functions and values, much less to identify how or where our existing regulations are failing to protect those functions and values. So there's two key pieces to that. It's essential to know what the functions and values that we are protecting are so that we can quantify them and figure out whether we're achieving no net loss of those functions. It boggles the mind that in the best available science document that is very thick, that was put together, we don't have that fundamental information necessary to figure out whether we're avoiding a net loss or not, much less whether the current regulations are getting the job done. Next, the analysis to date, we believe, fails to consider two key points: the effectiveness of our current rules, which look to us as though they're doing a really, really good job, and also the positive effect of the state, federal, and most important, local environmental protection programs that we put in place in San Juan County. We're talking about the land bank and the preservation trust and various other activities that we have done already because we care about our environment. They've had a dramatically positive effect that seems to be discounted almost entirely by those who want to make our rules tougher. I just couldn't even bring myself to say that because, well, anyway. Then finally, the proposals to date appear to be inconsistent with the comprehensive plan goals that have been adopted in San Juan County, as well as failing to properly balance the goals of the Growth Management Act and requirements of the Growth Management Act, including the protection of our current rural character. I won't go through these slides in detail. This slide and the next slide provide those goals I just talked about. This one is the goals of our comprehensive plan, which was reconfirmed last year, and says that one of our goals is to allow the use of property to the greatest extent possible while protecting critical area functions and values. I think that's the right standard. I can also tell you there are a lot of folks who disagree with that standard, and the folks who are promoting the current proposals around these critical area rules don't agree with that. They in fact think that we ought to be protecting critical areas as much as possible, and to heck with the use of our property. That's not a quote, that's a paraphrase, but I think it's valid and I'll add it. The next is that our critical area provisions should be balanced and related to impacts. Here's the 14 goals of the Growth Management Act on this slide. I won't read any of these right now, but you can have a look at them. The Growth Management Act is not all about protecting the environment. Protecting the environment is one of the goals of 14. The others include our economy, our property rights, sound permitting, citizen participation, and other things. But I wanted to turn to the meat of the matter. Buffers. Buffers are what we're going to talk about a lot because it is the tool that's been chosen by our planning folks. It's a tool that's favored by the Department of Ecology. And I think it's just because it's easy. It's an easy way for them to think about going about this. They don't have to deal with the tough questions of what the function and value, measuring the functions and values, figuring out what the causes of potential problems might be. Instead, the idea is let's just move everybody back away from anything that we think is critical. Because that's what the buffer idea is. You find the edge of the critical area. Let's use wetlands because that is where we are right now in the process. You'd find the edge of the wetland and then figure out how far back away from the wetland your house has to be. How far back away from the wetland you have to keep your animals. How far back away from the wetlands you have to have the driveway, and so on and so forth. So, buffer is a word that you might not all be familiar with. More folks are familiar perhaps with the concept of a setback. A buffer is kind of like a setback on steroids. Because, and what I mean by that is we all know that the setback is how far your foundation has to be back away from something, how far you have to build. It's very simple. You can't build inside the setback. Okay, buffers are sort of like that, except with a setback you can play in the front yard. Your dog can play in the front yard. You can put your garden in the front yard and not violate a setback, as long as you don't put up a building. With a buffer, that may not be true, because in a buffer there are limitations on the activities that can be carried on. And so we have to think very carefully about these, and that's why I said earlier this is going to affect existing structures as well, because activities are activities. Whether you have a house yet or don't have a house yet, you still have a place where you carry on the activities of daily living in our rural community on your property. The current proposals would seek to expand the buffers, make them wider around wetlands, around streams, around the shoreline, and other yet to be designated wildlife habitat conservation areas. The buffers that are currently being proposed are from 300 feet up to 450 feet potentially, depending on which of several regulations folks take. Now there are some smaller ones, even down to the size we have now, but that all depends on the details. One example I'll give you that's particularly maddening, if you look in the best available science and dig your way through that, you will find an analysis that goes this way. At the shoreline, 100 feet is generally considered acceptable minimum buffer area. In fact, based on the particularities of San Juan County, in most cases, the best available science says that 85 feet is probably enough. Yet, the consultants and our planning department are recommending 150 feet. just to be sure. So this is problematic to me. That's an additional 50 feet or more that you would ordinarily have use of, that without any basis in the science, the suggestion is we should be carving out of your property. There's also two other big changes in connection with buffers. The first is that historically buffers haven't been interpreted to cross roads or driveways. Now they will. And the other is a expanded definition of what's an impervious surface. We could ask some questions about that later if we have those. I got to move along to make sure we get Ed some time. Here, more buffer proposals. Limiting the proposals to limit the activities in buffers. Some of those include things like prohibiting topping of trees, limiting the pruning that you can do, a removal of downed wood, for example. Limits on gardens, limits on fruit trees and lawns. Requiring retention of 100% of vegetation at the wetland edge or at the shoreline edge is part of the proposal. And prohibiting the use of buffer areas for extended periods of time by your non-agricultural animals, horses. I'm not sure if they mean dogs, I keep asking. They always laugh at me, but if you can't tell, a non-agricultural domestic animal sounds like a dog to me. And that's what the language seems to be. And the limits would be either only for 2 months a year, could you use a particular buffer area with those animals, or not more than 1 per acre. Okay, I don't know. We're not done working our way through that, but, you know, animals like friends. Next would be a few other issues. There's a focus on stream habitat. Ed will hit this with some materials he's got. I make the little joke, I didn't think we had that many streams living in the county that we needed to have habitat for them. But anyway, a few people got that joke. Anyway, the streams aren't a joke though. And many of the streams that are shown on this map as potential streams are really the ditches beside the road or have as their source a ditch beside the road. The entire shoreline being a critical area is another issue that one can raise. As well as I said, failure to adequately protect existing uses and activities. I'll close and pass this off to Ed with a slide that I think gets into what I believe this is really about. And as I started this presentation, the county has a lot of flexibility in how it goes about doing this regulation. There's no question that we need to protect our critical areas. There's no question that all of us here, and I would suspect everyone in this room, although I don't know quite everybody, I suspect everyone in this room moved here or has grown up here and wouldn't in any way think about doing something knowingly that would harm our critical areas. It's important for the islands to be, well, the reasons that we moved here. The question is how we go about that regulation. So to me the first question is whether the way we've done it already has been good enough. And if we're going to make changes in it, what kind of changes do we want? So do we want a community that leans toward paternalism, or do we want a community that continues to rely on the individual stewardship that has brought us to where we are today? Do we want to rely on consistent enforcement of whatever rules we make, or do we think it makes sense instead to make more restrictive rules for everybody? I know what I think, it's probably clear, but I'll let you make up your own conclusions. The question I would ask is why should we have people give up their reasonable hopes and dreams around their homes in the island? And now I'm asking everybody here to think about our neighbors who aren't here yet. The folks who own property, the folks who, like me, up until about 5 years ago, knew what the view was, had an idea where the house was going to be, and they spent every hour that they weren't actually at their job thinking about how I can get up to Orcas. We need to be thinking about some of those people, because they're going to be dramatically affected by this. And so it goes to how we want to act toward those folks. And it boils down to, all of this, to me, boils down to how we want to treat our neighbors. But with that, let me introduce one of our neighbors from Lopez. Ed Kilduff has spent hours and hours and hours combing over the databases that the county has in its GIS system. I'll let Ed talk about that. And putting together the math and the renderings necessary to show you some maps that I think will be very eye-opening. So let's do-si-do here and hand this off to Ed.